Hope works out for you.
You know, you can laugh, but I have witnessed a millennium of treachery and oppression from the males of the species, and I have nothing but contempt for the whole libidinous lot of them.
Then why are you talking to me?
I don't have a date for the prom.
Well, gosh. I wonder why not. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with your sales pitch.
Men are evil. Will you go with me?
I've got a question for you today, friends. Do women like men more than they like other women? In contrast, do men like women more than other men? We might assume that, given the lascivious propensity of the two sexes to engage in that terribly degenerate act of having consensual sex in the missionary position for the purpose of procreation, ugh. Sure, on some level, women and men tend to like being around each other just a little bit. But what about non-sexual relationships? Do women really only feel comfortable when they are in the company and presence of other women, and men, in contrast, in the company of other men? Particularly now with the unending claims of toxic masculinity and sexism against women, which is manifest in mainstream media, or so we're told, is the reason why there have traditionally been fewer women involved in certain hobbies, comic books, video games, tabletop and role-playing games, and so on. Simply because women weren't properly represented. There weren't any women they could identify with. And if that's true, it would explain why men tend to be more drawn to these, right? If women identify more with other women and tend to prefer to be around women, and men are the opposite, well, then if most of the characters in a game or a TV show or any piece of media are mostly male, the feminist rationale would be that that's why it tends to draw more males. Were they only to add a few more women, suddenly women would be more interested. At least, that's the premise, right? The only thing that produces a disparity in the gender breakdown of certain hobbies is representation of their own gender. And according to this same logic, it's why men in these hobbies tend to be so prone to disrespect wahmen, because more female inclusion means less male inclusion, less male representation. Now, of course, the feminist argument is the future is female and you gotta deal with it? But hang on, they actually might have something of a point. Extensive research has shown that we just tend to prefer the company of people who are more similar to us than they are dissimilar. We like to be around our own. As such, you can see the rationale. The reason women don't get into comic books and video games and tabletop games the way they do fashion is only because there aren't a lot of female characters or people in positions of power, right? All we need is more representation.
Let's find out the number of makeup companies that are owned by women. I'll save you the trouble. It's 0. But of course you're saying, Britta, aren't you a hypocrite? You're plastered with glitter and goo from head to toe, just like the rest of us. Well, I also pay income tax and pull over for cops, but that doesn't mean I support a country that oppresses its citizens.
And this has become increasingly more and more mainstream of a narrative over the last decade or so. Summed up so eloquently by Brie Larson, Captain Marvel herself, in this diatribe about who's allowed to watch A Wrinkle in Time and that she doesn't care what white men think.
Am I saying that I hate white dudes? No.
No.
I don't believe you.
Yep, that's good shit.
Good reviews help films gross money. Good reviews slingshot films into awards contenders. A good review can change your life. It changed mine. I do not need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work for him about A Wrinkle in Time. It wasn't made for him. I want to know what that film meant to women of color, to biracial women, to teen women of color, to teens that are biracial. And for the third time, I don't hate white dudes. These are just facts. These are not my feelings.
Oh my God.
Yes, a white woman speaking for black women. Imagine my shock. But similarly, she said she didn't really care what white men had to say about her film. Why? Because it wasn't made for them. This movie and others like it that have become inescapable, movies not based around a plot but based around a political agenda, are designed to bring more representation. And if there's more representation, then women will feel more welcome in whatever hobby it happens to be. Now, of course, we're talking about giant companies like Disney, so they don't care so much about the representation, so much as getting more butts in seats. Let's pretend that there's no financial involvement here, and believe Brie Larson is truly telling what she believes to be the truth. Because without Captain Marvel, little girls will never be inspired to become strong, independent women with a personality flatter than their own asses.
That's a damn shame.
Without Ray and her equally absent character, women wouldn't be able to really enjoy and appreciate probably the biggest film sensation and franchise of all time. Because up until now, there haven't been enough strong independent women. But now finally, with representation, girls and women alike can at last become interested in Star Wars. That's why those Rey and Rose Tico figures have been flying off the shelves, huh? And while I agree that, as a creative person, Jordan Peele can and should cast whoever he wants in his projects, is it true that films starring an all-black cast have some kind of positive effect on the African-American community? On an individual African-American person's self-esteem? Does it affect their aspirations, as we are, again, so often told? All we need is representation. All we need is diversity. And all the ills of society will be ameliorated. Well, that's a nice thought. It's just a thought until we can tell it to be gone by examining it with evidence. So today, let's find out more as we investigate homophily and representation in media. As a quick recap on social identity theory, it's a theory I've mentioned many times before, but it posits that we will always tend to prefer to be around people who are more similar to us than are dissimilar. And we have seen significant support for this theory across pretty much any and all groups. It's been examined across countless populations since its inception. And although there are exceptions to the rule, generally speaking, yes, we tend to prefer to be around those who are similar to us. And the extent of that similarity can range from things that are intrinsic and immutable, such as race or country of origin, to banal and mundane, such as finding that people tend to prefer to be around others wearing the same color shirt as them. But there's always been kind of an exception when it comes to certain stigmatized groups. In his early work on stigma, Irving Goffman wrote of this, that sometimes the stigmatized will tend to reject their shared in-group, knowing that there are negative associations with that in-group. So with all that in mind, let's look specifically at sex. And see if there really is a reason for which women or men may be more likely to like female or male characters. Are women uniquely prone to like female characters over men? Well, Dunham, Barron, and Benage, 2015, examined implicit, that's paraconscious, and explicit, that's stated, self-description, intergroup gender preferences in children at various ages. And they found that, as we would expect according to social identity theory, that young children tend to prefer others of the same sex, both implicitly and explicitly. But we actually start to see something interesting with the girls. Girls as young as 5 and 6 already had a much stronger in-group preference towards girls and identification with other girls than did the boys. And this trend of preference only increased over time. While actually the opposite occurs in males. As males matured, they became less preferential towards the same sex. There's obviously an element of puberty going on there.
Hey there, Bobby. I guess they found a cure for the cooties.
I don't know. What are cooties?
Well, when I was a boy, that's what we called the germs you got from girls.
Oh, you mean like chlamydia?
Huh?
But it's interesting that women continue to want to hang around other women more and more, and actually come to hold more negative opinions towards men as they age. Now, this is the first of a lot of studies I'm going to mention today that use something called the IAT, the Implicit Associations Test. A measurement I dislike, and I've mentioned my dislike for many times, but that's really the measurement that's been used the most to study this. And it's being used because sometimes what people say is not what they really think or feel. Thus, just measuring explicit responses may not get at the crux or the core of someone's emotions. Participants will often respond the way that they think the researcher wants them to respond, that's acquiescence bias, or respond the way they think society expects them to respond, that's social desirability bias, or just tend to avoid any questions with extreme answers one way or the other. To circumvent this potential confound, participants were asked to respond to a series of faces in quick succession, that's the IAT, with the speed of a correct answer indicating implicit biases, but I'll explain it in a bit more detail later. But first, back to women's preference for other women.
You're both girls! Girls can't love girls! Girls can't love girls! Girls can't love girls! Hey, wait, you forgot your bag!
Skoworski and Lawrence, 2001, used a similar method as Dunham et al., except in this case they asked 5th graders and college students about their preferences for one gender or another in general, but also about their preference for a female soldier versus a male soldier. All of the groups, both the 5th grade males and females and the adult males and females, explicitly stated that they preferred women and being around women over men. children of both sexes and adult women also overtly and explicitly preferred the female soldiers, but college-aged men preferred the male soldiers. In terms of implicit biases, children reacted with similar expedience to male and female names when those names were paired with pleasant items or unpleasant items. But college-age women alone reacted much more quickly when female names were associated with a positive descriptor. Again, this is the IAT. In this case, a name was flashed on the screen. These names had been established to either be paired up with something positive or something negative, and then once the name was flashed, the participant has to click a button that indicates the correct direction. So if I say that female names are associated with flowers and happiness and rainbows, and I see a female name, then I would want to choose happiness or flowers or rainbows. The faster your reaction time, the more bias, because it indicates that you're processing heuristically. What we can draw from this, though, is that as girls age, again, they come to express greater preference for the same sex, subconsciously. And while everyone is apparently more prone to say that they prefer women explicitly, implicitly, men are at most indifferent to women, indicating generally very positive attitudes towards the fairer sex from all people during both childhood and adulthood. Further, Rudman and Goodwin 2004 illustrated that for women, there is a definitive propensity to be attracted to the same gender than there is in men, attracted socially, not sexually.
へではここは目覚めのキスを普通に起こせないの
Once again, this study utilized that pesky implicit associations measure, but this time used a gender-oriented version of the scale. Similarly to what we've seen before, the researchers in this study noted that both men and women were likely to identify with their shared gender in-group, but also that women particularly associated themselves with other women positively, and not with men. In the words of Rudman and Goodwin, quote, "Women can be characterized as, if I am good and I am female, females are good, whereas men can be characterized as, even if I am good and I am a male, men are not necessarily good," which I think thoroughly describes the current area of inquiry that we're looking at here, in the way that a lot of men probably do think about themselves, almost like they've been told to think about themselves that way. After all, the American Psychological Association now trains therapists and counselors to treat masculinity as a kind of defect. In other words, we see that women tend to prefer other women, but men don't necessarily tend to prefer other men. Once again, as I've said, all of these studies are using the implicit associations test. And while I've critiqued it in the past, I will reiterate that it's a poor instrument because what it's really measuring is not racism or sexism, but rather cognitive heuristics. That's paraconscious processing that exists for an evolutionary reason, to help us to respond to stimuli quickly. So things that we're more used to, that are more familiar to us, we tend to respond to more expediently. This is not to say there is no use for this instrument. I think, for example, in this case, where you're just talking about preference towards your same group, it can potentially be valuable. Just be wary when you see the implicit associations instrument used in any study that then claims, oh, white people are racist. That's not necessarily what they're actually measuring.
Okay, I think I'm doing okay. Good. Black. Good. Good. I mean, no! Bad. Bad. Good. White. Bad.
I also want to point out for Rudman and Goodwin some of the basic assumptions that are posited by the researchers in their rationale, and some sort of similarities that I've seen across this research. That being that social norms, which they define as things such as male children being more likely to inherit their father's names than female children are to inherit their mothers, for wives to take the surname of their husbands, and for male leaders to be seen as stronger than female leaders, defines for the researchers that, quote, "men are culturally valued more than women." Okay, so male children are more likely to be named after their fathers. But what about the incredibly skewed nature of the US court systems? How it defers to women in almost all cases of divorce and childcare? Yes, most women still take their husband's last name. But what about all of the innocent men who are now being Me Too because all a woman need do is point and cry victim for anyone to just sit back and listen and believe? I mean, I know this study was published in 2004, so maybe that last bit is not relevant, but this is not a new thing. Women are the bearers of children, the progeny of our species. Do we say women and children first because women are less socially valuable, as Rudman and Goodwin state? If so, why do we send males off to violent conflict and not females? I mean, maybe it's just because women don't seem to be super great at those kinds of high-stress positions, just saying. But what about the massive overrepresentation of males in the homeless population? And what about the staggering suicide rates of men? How is that somehow proof that society values males over females? And that's where I see another major confound, maybe not in the research itself, but in how it's often interpreted. These researchers come to these conclusions because they're looking for something, and may actually end up interpreting the data in a different way than someone else who comes from a different background. You know, this gal. Just something to keep in mind as we go forward, that a lot of this research comes from the mindset that women are inherently disenfranchised. And with that, I think we're finally able to start answering some of those questions about representation and whether or not people like Brie Larson are right, and women are in particular need of seeing women in prominent roles in the media. I could keep going on and reading more and more studies addressing every single piece of research that's been done in this area, but instead let's just look at Hurlitz and Loven 2013 in their meta-analysis of 29 studies on gender and implicit bias on facial recognition. They found that women in general are better at remembering all faces, but they are particularly adept at recalling the faces of other women. In other words, once again, women are uniquely prone to recognize, remember, even maybe feel familiar with women over men. And while there's more we could go over, I think it's pretty definitive. Women prefer other women. It's also interesting to note that women aren't particularly fond of being subordinate to other females in the workplace. Rudman and Kilansky 2001 examined men and women's implicit responses to female authority and subservient roles, and while women responded more accurately in all conditions than men in terms of their accuracy to the IAT response, they were quicker to associate a negative word with a female authority figure than positive words. Further, Powell 2015 asked participants if they would rather have a male or female boss, or if they had no preference. Those with any preference at all largely said that they would prefer to have a male boss, while more women than men said that they would prefer to have a female supervisor. Both sexes generally preferred the male. When Powell threw gender expression into the mix, which is a little bit difficult to define of course, more feminine men said they preferred a female boss, while more masculine women said they preferred a male one. Just a little caveat to keep in mind, along with the obvious perspective from where this is coming. But with everything we've seen so far, we should be able to start answering those questions I posed in the opening, about representation and whether or not people like Brie Larson are right, and women are in particular need of seeing other women in prominent roles in media. And we've seen that maybe outside of leadership roles, women tend to prefer other women. But does that affect media enjoyment? Hook 2019 wanted to see if a character's gender changed the way women and men identified with that character, and if it in any way altered the way they experienced a story. Participants played a short choose-your-own-adventure type game about a character described as either male or female, a Jedi or a Sith. Oof, only male or female? Only a Sith deals in binaries. Male players generally identified with the character in the story regardless of the character's gender, but they did tend to prefer the Jedi over the Sith. In comparison, though, women identified much more strongly with the female characters, light side or dark. So it seems that maybe, yeah, girls dislike male characters, but those oh-so-sexist Star Wars fans don't seem to give a damn what gender a fictional character in their fantasy universe is. As long as it's a good character, it seems they're alright with it, whereas women do seem to gravitate towards female characters. We've also studied this in MMOs, from Marty et al. 2013, who found that men are much more likely to switch avatar gender than women. Men do it about 35% of the time, and women only 10%. I can attest to this myself, in that when given the option, I almost always choose a female avatar, or a female character. What can I say? I just want to be a fruity little elf ranger and prance around the forest.
Alright, listen to me, you knife-eared piece of shit. If you go any further with your piss-stained pubic hair you call a wig, I'm gonna wreck your shit so hard that you won't even be able to walk with your limp dick.
So yes, in summation, it seems women prefer to be around other women, prefer to interact with other women, and are more likely to identify with female characters. Does this somehow betray the existence of the supposed patriarchy? Sounds a little bit more matriarchal to me. I don't see how, considering everything we've looked at. The data are fairly consistent that men don't really give a damn about the sex of another person. They tend to prefer to be around women, if anything, and when it comes to fictional characters, they don't seem to care at all. And as we looked at, men tended to want to be closer to women and less close to men as they aged. If that's so, why would men want to keep women out of their hobbies? Instead, it seems that it's women who don't want to enter those spaces. I can say from having been to quite a number of comic shops in my life, I've always felt welcome. But maybe I'm an outlier. Maybe representation does matter, and that's all that these people need to start getting into these hobbies. But we also often hear that inclusion alone is not enough, hence why movies like Black Panther and now Captain Marvel often tout about how progressive they are, with realistic portrayals and representation of certain groups.
A race of noble warriors.
Heroes. Noble warrior heroes.
How embarrassing!
If that's true, we should be able to test it. Is seeing more accurate portrayals of a minority in-group impactful to members of that in-group? Well, Freiberg et al. 2008 showed images of several different mascots depicting various levels of cartoonishness of a Native American to a group of Native American students, and then asked about their plans for the future, their goals, their aspirations. Their responses were coded as either being achievement-oriented, which included things like getting good grades, getting a job, going to college, or otherwise, which I guess would include things like having fun and hanging out.
We've still got some corn left.
Hey, corn, now we can make whiskey.
We've been waiting hundreds of years for we just invented a town college.
Here, Injun, you want some firewater?
No. We were warned by our elders not to drink anything that would make us weak or silly.
Put it in their well.
While those exposed to former Cleveland Indians mascot Chief Wahoo reported the lowest achievement scores, scores were also lowered in those exposed to any of the mascots, including some of the more historically accurate ones, such as the Haskell Indian of the Haskell Indian Nations University. Seeing any representation forwarded reduced achievement scores. Similarly, Schmader, Block, and Lickel 2015 played clips from films depicting Latino characters speaking to one another to Hispanic participants, and asked the participants about their emotional responses to the stimuli. In one condition, the characters are some loco cholo eses homes.
Hey! Who locked the door, huh? I don't like locked doors around here! They make me crazy and shit! I was locked up and said, pass the wire! Pass the wire! I don't want no grilled cheese! No, Leroy! I'm bilingual, there's a difference!
And in the other, the characters are having a romantic, casual conversation about their life goals and their families. Participants reported similar levels of shame and anger towards fellow Latinos regardless of which clip they saw, and they felt actually the most amount of guilt towards being Latino in the dramatic scene. Seeing any portrayal of Hispanic people, realistic or not, reduced positive emotions about the Hispanic community. In other words, not only does mere representation not seem to help, even positive or realistic representation doesn't help either. Aronson et al. 2009 proposed that African Americans who were primed by photos of Barack Obama at the top of a standardized test would feel so inspired by the president that they would perform more competently on said test than if the test contained photos of John McCain instead. Gee, how do you think that one turned out, friends?
Hey, I told you to be focused, and you're not focused right now. Listen to what I'm saying. Hold up.
I'm sure you'll be shocked and surprised to learn that just thinking about old Barry had absolutely no effect on the students' test scores. In other words, yeah, there's not a lot of good evidence that representation does anything. And if it does, not often. As such, I must mention that McKinley, Maestro, and Warber 2014 did find that exposure to Latina celebrities in a music video forwarded higher reports of self-esteem from Latina participants. But it's important to note that this increased self-esteem was related to the talent of Latinas as singers or as dancers. Which, not to say that those aren't skills that people practice their entire lives, but it's not quite rocket surgery, right? Because that's usually what we hear when people talk about this, that groups need to see representation so that they know they can do anything. Well, here the one time that we see any kind of positive response is based on dancing and singing. So we've seen that, at least in minority groups, this doesn't seem to have the effect that we're told it does. But women are not technically a minority. Actually, they're technically the majority. So let's look at women.
Nice!
No, not like that. Maybe later. Ferguson 2012 had male and female participants watch an episode of a number of television shows that depicted women in sexually compromising situations, specifically violent ones. Some of the programs featured strong, independent women. That is actually the phrase that they use. Specifically, in this case, one of the stimuli they used was an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and others featuring submissive female characters in the scenario. You would think that the submissive portrayal of women would affect women's attitude towards their gender, and it did, but not in the way that you might think. Women had the highest opinion of their own gender when they watched a sexually violent show that featured a submissive female protagonist. Submissive depictions of women, which you may note are labeled here as negative, resulted in the most positive opinions towards women by other women. At the same time, women felt more anxious about the submissive female in the sexual scenario, while in contrast, men felt more anxious about the assertive female in the clip. But I mean, does this scene not make you a little anxious, lads?
It's gonna be slow for you. That's right, puppy. Willow's gonna make you bark.
If providing neutral and positive representations does not seem to have much of an effect, if any effect at all, and instead even potentially have a detrimental effect, is there any way media might have positive influence on minorities when it comes to exposure and representation? Well, we could examine the concept of stereotype lift, and I think this is something that's going on a lot, which posits that stereotypes made against the majority will raise the self-esteem of the minority in-group members. That is, when the out-group is devalued in the media, then it can raise the self-esteem of the minority in-group. To understand the potential effects of this, Apple and Weber, 2017, conducted a meta-analysis of 12 studies on stereotype lift to examine if there was any major effect of denigrating the majority on minority group members, and found a small but statistically significant effect on achievement and self-efficacy. So it doesn't seem like showing positive portrayals of the in-group really helps, but perhaps putting down the out-group does, at least to a small degree. And that might explain why so much of this diverse media is not focused so much on truly strong and powerful, interesting characters with their own merits, but rather on disparaging white males. In other words, it doesn't seem like representation, even positive representation, has a whole lot of an effect, although besmirching the outgroup might. Why is it then that it doesn't seem there's any positive effects of representation? We're told all the time that all we need is more representation, more women in this, that, or the other, precisely because it's supposed to lead to some sort of positive outcomes for those minority groups. But hang on a second, let's go back to women. Remember that women tend to identify more with female characters. While they may not have been particularly fond of the strong female character in that sexual violence study, it does seem that women prefer other women. So why does this effect of not necessarily feeling more positive about your in-group when exposed to it in media not seemingly transfer onto women as a group? Well, I'd say we have to take a look at systems justification theory proposed by Jost and Banach in 1994, which posits that people in high positions of social influence and power will highly associate, and frequently associate, with those similar to themselves and in their shared in-group. They're just of a higher class.
Because we have class. And having class means being able to mix with people that are beneath you.
Mm-hmm.
Come on.
Your shirt doesn't even fit, by the way. You want to be an elitist, get yourself a tailor.
Oh. No, Dee, that's severely lacking
Too much?
class.
My bad.
But those in a lower echelon of power or social influence may tend to distance themselves actually from their shared social group, in contrast to what we typically find in social identity theory. They may even come to venerate the out-groups, given that they have a higher level of social clout. In other words, lower status people may show greater liking for higher status people who do not belong to the same social groups as they do, and are actually quite dissimilar from themselves. The researchers describe this as a type of coping mechanism that attempts to justify to the individual why there are inherent inequalities in human existence. But let's look specifically at how systems justification functions in terms of intergroup contact. Rudman, Feinberg, and Fairchild, 2002, examined relatively high and low status groups using an implicit associations test to evaluate implicit biases in Jews, Asians, fat people, and poor people. In this study, Jews and Asians, while minorities according to population, were considered by the researchers to be relatively higher status, and as expected, they tended to have fairly strong in-group preferences. While fat people, well, they had no tolerance for their flabby friends, and showed much more preference for thin people. Similarly, the poor liked the rich more than their fellow impoverished people, but only at the implicit level. When participants were asked to describe their feelings about their in-groups, both the poor and the porky reported much more positive assessments. Hey, wait a minute. That actually might explain so much of the seemingly forced, hollow, and also hostile self-aggrandizing that we see on social media. Holy crap, did I just identify the science behind Black Twitter? Still more evidence on out-group liking over in-group preference can be found in Jost Pelham and Carvalho 2002, who also used the IAT to examine the same effect of systems justification in several different groups, including university students from schools of differing prestige, in this case being Stanford and San Jose University. Students from the higher status school, Stanford, reported higher self-esteem and more in-group favoritism to other students from Stanford, while in contrast, the students from San Jose had lower self-esteem and were less attached to their classmates. While the Jost et al. 2002 study gives us some external reliability, Jost and Burgess 2000 examined the same concept in an experimental fashion by having students from the University of Maryland and the University of Virginia read some invented statistics about the achievement levels of the students both at their own institution and the opposing one. Students who believed that their school's population was relatively low status, low in accomplishment in comparison to the other school displayed greater ambivalence towards their alma mater and more favorable attitudes towards the school that they believed was of higher status and higher achievement. In other words, this can happen if there is no actual difference between the groups. It can be completely invented, such that if I tell you that your group is oppressed all the time, well, you might just be subject to some of the effects of systems justification. In other words, if you spend your life thinking that you're part of a low status group, you probably don't want to associate with them as much. Sure, some people do, but you're also going to have this possibility. It also might be why media isn't some sort of panacea for minorities. Probably particularly not so when you've told them they're oppressed, when you've told them that they're not the same. Same goes for women, but interestingly, not quite. Because if we go along with the argument that there is a patriarchy, that men are in charge, despite any claims to the contrary, wouldn't men have a greater deal of homophily towards other men? As we've seen, people of higher social groups tend to have more in common and desire to spend more time with those of their shared high-status social group. But, as we've also seen, men seem to be okay interacting with women. In fact, they frequently prefer it. In contrast, it seems that the women are the ones more likely to act as if they're part of a higher-status social group. Perhaps that's because we are. What I'm saying by all of this is that given minority groups don't appear to be particularly uplifted by just seeing people visually reminiscent of themselves in media, and given that men generally like women and don't seem to be turned off by media that features them prominently, well then wouldn't it just make sense that we can explain all of these findings if we place women as the actual higher status social group between the two sexes? Despite the fact that African Americans and Latino people in this country have access to all types of affirmative action programs, opportunities, and are essentially legally untouchable lest someone be called a racist, as we just recently saw in the case of Jussie Smollett, released with all charges dropped because he was a pillar to the community.
I've been truthful and consistent on every single level since day one.
Why the fuck you lying? Why you always lying? Oh my god, stop you fucking lying.
On March 26, the twisting saga of Jussie Smollett's alleged attack and subsequent arrest took another shocking turn when the 16-count felony indictment against the Empire actor was dropped.
Jussie, what do you think this will do for your character on Empire?
The actor left a Chicago courthouse a free man.
Hacks!
Yeah, I guess I called that one wrong. It's almost like I thought there was some semblance of justice left in the world. Silly me. And you know what, yeah, maybe there is, but just not in Chi-Town. Anyway, my point is, despite the many opportunities and advantages that are actually available to minorities, Black people, Native people, and Latinos in this country all do tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than whites and Asians. So they can still be considered low status, or at least minority status, hence why, according to systems justification, they may not experience any measurable edifying outcomes from seeing even highly positive representations of their minority group on television or in any type of media. They might, you know, something that might help, not telling them they're constantly oppressed, not continually hammering home just how low status they are. Women, in contrast, though, do make up over 50% of the population. By definition, they are not a minority. But I don't think that's the only reason why they tend to behave more like a high-status group than a low-status group. I think we do so because we are, and we always have been. Men tend to be fine with women. I think they like women just fine. And that includes liking female characters and women in their media.
has nothing to do with you being a woman. I like women. I've just got a little problem with scientists.
Colonel, I logged over 100 hours in enemy airspace during the Gulf War. That tough enough for you? Or are we gonna have to arm wrestle?
Sure, Captain Marvel made a ton of money. We always knew that it would. And I really don't think many people were surprised when it did well. I don't think people were boycotting it because they thought it would fail. I mean, that did work with Solo, but that was coming off the heels of The Last Jedi. Marvel sold this movie as the necessary film that you have to watch before you see Avengers Endgame. They told people they wouldn't be able to understand the climax of a 10-year-old film empire if they didn't see this movie with a retconned character. So guess what? Everybody saw it, myself excluded. And they had no reason not to. The average person didn't hear a lick of what Brie Larson thinks about people paying to see her movie or review her movie. But up until this point, were women somehow not able to enjoy the previous films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe because they lacked a strong leading lady? Everyone has made this comparison by now 100 times, but Wonder Woman did just fine, without any of this weird social justice posturing. And you don't have to take my word for it, the statistics indicate that. Plenty of women love the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Yes, women identify more with other women than they do with men. And yes, that does mean that potentially, some women will want to avoid a lot of cape films because they don't star a woman. But I don't think that that's the real crux of why those women aren't going to see that movie anyway. People have different tastes, and probably women who only like to be around other women aren't going to be interested in a bunch of people punching things and blowing crap up. That type of woman probably wouldn't even be interested if they made a live-action version of this atrocity.
You are all capable of great things.
We found out who's inside the Iron Man suit. It's this genius new student named Riri Williams.
Amy's the only one who gets me.
Oh my god, I think that constitutes a violation of the NAP. And of course, this doesn't apply to all women. There are plenty of nerdy girls who are pretty into this stuff. They don't need any more incentive. You know what would incentivize me to go to the cinema again? Good films. Good films where some sort of social justice political narrative is not the crux. I would have much rather gone to see a film about Monica Rambeau, because I love Monica Rambeau, than Carol freaking Danvers. And I know they introduced her in the last 5 minutes, great. But if this really was all about diversity and inclusion and all that stuff, they would have made Monica Rambeau Captain Marvel. Hey, you know what would get my butt in a seat? Go get Edgar Wright or someone similar to direct a Next Wave movie. Sorry for the aside. What's more important to note about all of this, about women in films and media, is that women in films and media does not turn men away from said media. I suppose that feminists have a point when they say that women won't like a piece of media if it doesn't feature female characters, but again, that falls on the women, not on the men. The onus is upon the female population to get into this stuff. Men aren't keeping them out of it. Ellen Ripley, Sarah Connor, Princess Leia, for frig's sake, are all beloved, strong female characters, and by strong, I mean they actually are interesting characters that are enjoyed by both men and women and have been for decades. As far as I can tell, men are fine with women being in film. They're not trying to exclude you. They just want good characters. And additionally, again, there really isn't any evidence that watching a strong, independent woman like Carol Danvers is going to make women, I don't know, go into STEM or go into the Air Force or whatever. Media doesn't generally have very large effect sizes. We've seen this time and time again. But in this case, it looks like there might actually be a boomerang effect, meaning it goes in the opposite direction from what is anticipated. Obviously, I'm not saying minorities and women shouldn't be in films, of course not. But I am saying that the claim of representation in media, that it will solve poverty in the black community and magically equalize the percentage men to women who are interested in technical fields, that's rigmarole. It's absurdist. And as I said, the data seem to actually point in the opposite direction. I know this comes as a shock to some of the more feminist inclined, but men like women. And it's not men keeping women out of these hobbies, it's women keeping women out of these hobbies. Because they're not interested in them. And that's okay. I think something more important to take away from all of this is that representation in and of itself, it doesn't matter how positive they are. It does seem that there aren't really any positive outcomes to being exposed to that. Now, I think more research needs to be done, as it does in pretty much every field and area of research. I think I can say, at least as of now, diversity doesn't mean dick. At least not as far as it applies to changing the world by depicting X number of Y minority in a certain piece of media. And that's why I'm prone to think that this attempt at increasing diversity is not so much about uplifting lower status minority groups through representation. Well, at least it's why I'm suspect of that, given that many on the left reject quantitative empiricism and the scientific method in general as oppressive systems that need to be decolonized. But the fact that we lack any good data-driven rationale for the supposition that the mere presence of minorities has any real positive outcomes? Yeah, I don't think what's going on here is adding diversity in order to uplift lower status people. Instead, let's go back to stereotype lift, of castigating the majority outgroup in order to improve the self-esteem of the minority population. Is that not more accurately what the point of all of this is? To systematically utilize the media, both creative and informative, to cast shame upon the majority, white people, and particularly white males, such that white maleness eventually becomes a stigmatized status, and as a result, white males may come to view themselves under the lens of systems justification, in response to that stigma. Is it not more that the goal of this is to make the majority feel odious and loathsome, such that they themselves become a low-status group through self-perception? Becoming low status functionally while remaining the statistical majority. And we know that low status groups can tend to distance themselves from those who are similar to them, and often come to hold higher status groups in high esteem. That's what I think this is really about. Not about raising one group up, but about pushing another group down. That's why so much of the rhetoric surrounding Captain Marvel was not really about girl power as much as it was about how it's not a movie made for straight white men because they're so toxic and awful, right? Not elevating women and minorities, shuttering white men. And I think that's what happened with Captain Marvel and why it went in the direction it did. The writing process began with the character's appearance, with her gender, and then everything else was built around that. And when that's how your writing process works, you done messed up. Scrap it, ball it up, throw it away, and start over. You can find no better example of this than J.K. Rowling's ongoing Twitter spurgery. J.K., no one would have cared if you had written Hermione as a black girl in the books, but you didn't. And this retroactive attempt at adding diversity and hardcore gay sexual relationships into your story only illustrate how vapid and shallow this entire trend is.
Snake and Lupin were in the middle of the empty hall, doing it, and Dobby was watching!
Not only is this pharisaical display insulting, it's also, as we've seen, at best pointless, but also potentially the cause of more harm than good. And with the case of Jordan Peele, as I said, he's a creator, he can do whatever he wants. Although I would say, were the positions reversed, there would be a hell of a lot of backlash. If, I don't know, for example, Michael Bay said he wasn't going to cast any black people in his movie. And it's fine for him to give people of his own race a job because he feels that they deserve it. I think that's fine. But the idea that somehow this is going to change society, there's just no evidence for that. So every time you hear someone say, oh, we need more diversity, we need more inclusion, we need more representation of this, that, or the other in films, remember that it doesn't seem as though there's any real purpose for that, outside of egotistical autofellatio, if not something downright kind of sinister. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. As always, you can support my work on Patreon, Subscribestar, and Streamlabs, which is essentially just PayPal. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for all of your support, and Altana Volt.